This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 338, Tailwind CSS. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Today we're talking about Tailwind CSS with Oliver Davies. Oliver is a freelance software consultant based in the UK and a lead software developer at Transport for Wales. He's an Acquia triple certified expert and maintains a number of contrib modules on Drupal.org, including override node options and Tailwind CSS StarterKit theme. Oliver, welcome to the show and thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me back on again.
And as Oliver just alluded to, he's previously on the show for episode 175 and 204, if you want to listen to those. I'm Nick Laughlin, and today my co-hosts are, as usual, John. Welcome to the show.
Hi, everyone. Glad to be here.
And Martin Anderson-Klutz is also joining us again for the third week. Welcome to the show.
Thanks. Great to be here.
And we have a quick update this week. So we now have a target release date for Drupal 10, which is August 17th, 2022. So I'm pretty excited about that. How about you guys?
Yeah, I think it's a little later though, right? What did that get pushed back? Wasn't it originally in June, maybe?
I think so. I think there were some dependency questions and issues that needed to get resolved and some testing fixes that needed to get resolved, so that they pushed it back, I think, a couple of months.
I'm surprised at how quickly they seem to be coming around now. I remember having these discussions with people when Drupal 8 came out, and then suddenly we're talking about Drupal 10. So, interesting to see the things speeding up.
I mean, it's exciting, right? It's like yes, new versions and like an easy upgrade path. Like, yeah, this is great.
Yeah, I'm pretty excited about some of the changes coming in CK Editor 5.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing that as well. We've had a couple of people talk about that on the show.
Yeah, I'm hoping to see some of I think the Symfony dependencies have been bumped as well. So I tend to use auto wiring and also configuration quite a lot. So hopefully some of those changes have gone in to Drupal 10. So hoping.
Very cool. So let's move on to our primary topic this week, which is Tailwind CSS. So let's start with the softball. What is Tailwind CSS?
Short answer is it's a CSS framework. It's an open source project. So it's all available on GitHub for anybody to look at and contribute to. The difference being, when you think about CSS frameworks, is it contains mostly lots of very small, reusable utility classes rather than rather large classes. So the difference being that it's really easy to port across projects and reuse and to build really custom designs with. So it's not like maybe like a Bootstrap site where you look at it as a site and go, yeah, that looks like a Bootstrap site. Because the classes are so low level, then it's really easy to make really custom, different looking designs using the same framework, which is lovely.
So I've seen over the past couple of weeks, it's like social media knows that we're having a Tailwind show, and on my Twitter stream, I've seen people really excited about Tailwind CSS, and I've also seen most recently somebody the other day who was not so excited about it and was basically saying like it's hard and complicated to use. So I think my question here is like, why are people excited about Tailwind CSS? And on the flip side, why might somebody not be so excited about it?
Okay, so not excited. It is a little bit sort of controversial because it's sort of when people start doing CSS, they're told to do things in a very certain way. Right? You write HTML first and everything's really clean and you keep your classes to a minimum and clean semantic markup and you put all of your styling in the CSS. Tailwind sort of turns that on its head. And by that, I mean the classes that Tailwind CSS gives you are things like font bold and text large and margin 5. So things that you're typically told, don't do this. It's sort of turning it around on its head, which is why some people maybe find it a little bit controversial or don't like it. And I think because you're not used to seeing it, having all these classes in your HTML now, it can be quite. Everyone has this moment they're like, oh, I don't like the look of that, and I had it, and so does everybody else. But when you sort of start using it, you can say, oh, this is a lot faster, and I can iterate quickly, and I can change things on this element or this text, and I know it's only going to affect this element. I'm not worried where else it's going to affect things. So when you start seeing some of the benefits that it brings, you sort of get over that a little bit to begin with.
So it's more specific then to like, hey, I want to add 5 pixels of margin all around this thing. Like, let me add the class for that, as opposed to like being more like componentized or like more generic.
Yeah. So like from a bootstrap approach, you might have a class of navbar and say, here's all the HTML that you need to make a navbar. And that links up with their CSS. Tailwind's approach is very much the opposite. So you write all your markup. And usually you'll start with just plain HTML with no styling at all. And you'll start by building up that navbar component using your own set of styles. And like I said, they're really low level. So things like flex for display flex. And like it's that type of level. So it's not really componentized at all, although there are various libraries, including some official first-party ones. But yeah, that's what makes it really reusable, because you're going to use a class of flex on project A and also on project B, whereas you might not have the same navbar or the same layout or the same card, for example.
Does that does that make HTML like crazy bloated in that regard? If you have like one element and it has like, 25 classes on it to get it to look the way that it needs to look?
Yeah, that's that first initial discussion reaction that everybody has. Like, look at all these classes. Whereas I just want it to be a sidebar something. I don't want to have to say it's flex and this and that. But I guess on the flip side, I remember doing this, and there was a particular thing I remember building using like a BEM style on a project once. And it was some like sidebar inner, outer, top, bottom wrapper or something really. I was struggling to think of the name for this thing. And essentially it's a flex component with some spacing and some margin. And I remember getting into all this, it was really hard to do at the time. And what do I name this? And it was really tricky. And I remember going back once I'd sort of started doing more with Tailwind and utility classes. And that's that. It's a flex container and it does this and it does that.
It's that's nuts, because in my head right now I'm having like this debate with myself on like, because I can see both sides of it, and I don't hopefully by the end of this, myself as well as our listeners will have a path they want to go down. But I'm internally having that conversation with myself right now.
But everybody does to begin with. And I remember the whole Tailwind project came out. So Adam Wathen is the creator, who's a Laravel developer primarily, was building an idea for a SaaS on YouTube through live streaming. And he was building up this thing and then starts using what was an early version of, it wasn't Tailwind yet, but it was just some styles he was copying and pasting, and things like flex and font 2 and font 3 and text red and whatever. So just copied and pasted classes. And as he's building up this SaaS, everyone's always like, what's that CSS framework you're using? And then like it came from there. So it really came from this out of nowhere sort of side effect thing. But yeah, like I remember watching those streams, and there's one that's styling a card using utility styles. And I remember looking at it going, I don't like that. That seems a bit weird to me. But then sort of over time, it sort of grew on me. And it's not the only utility framework. Other people have come to the same sort of idea for performance, for example, whereas Adam's one was about reusability. I want to reuse that class on a different project. But yeah, everybody has that moment. It's like, oh, look at all those classes. This is wrong. I don't like it. But there is a post I've put in the show notes that Adam did. It's called Utility Classes and Separation of Concerns. So it's a really good post that he's done about, this is how I'd start doing it this way, in the sort of typical traditional way. And that falls down for these reasons. And so he explains how he came to this idea. But yeah, everybody has that, that initial reaction.
So you've touched on reusability. Are there any other benefits of using Tailwind?
I like it, partly because it's faster. It takes time to sort of go between switching from HTML to CSS and back again. The nice thing about Tailwind is once you've got a watcher running, it's always looking behind the scenes and always also compiling, and you don't have to leave your HTML really at that point. So that's nice. Reusability is a big thing. I've done a series of posts of UIs that I've rebuilt. I rebuilt the Drupal Bartik theme with Tailwind a while ago. I did the Acquia platform dashboard. Was doing the platform SH one. I've done a few of them, and they're all built they all look completely different, but they're all built with the same CSS framework. So there's a real advantage there to be able to use a flex class or a text MD class across different projects. And I guess the other one that springs to mind for me is the size of the resulting style sheet that you get. So originally, it generated all these classes for you, and then you had to purge them out at the end. Whereas now Tailwind uses a just-in-time compiler by default. So it only generates the classes that you need, first of all, in your style sheet, which is great. But because you're reusing that flex class across multiple components and pages, you only need to declare it once. So on a project that you're using Tailwind on, your resulting CSS might be kilobytes rather than megabytes, rather than having all these different components that do display flex over and over again. So they're the main ones for me, I think.
So I guess one question that's coming to mind as you're talking about this, how much customization of CSS classes and things are you doing if you're using Tailwind then? Is it just providing a base level like unit classes, and then you're just creating some modifications? Or are you really just using the base ones generally and very rarely creating your own?
There's sort of two sides to that. So it gives you, there's a configuration file that you get out of the box. You can configure Tailwind itself with a class that it generates for you, first of all. So it comes with, for example, a lot of colors out of the box, various different colors. But if your project, so the default ones maybe are all called by text red, and then there's different versions of red, right? So they're all 50, 100, 200, up to I think 900 or maybe 950 now. So that's the default scale. But on your project, you might want to be text primary or text secondary or something, or different shades of red or not red at all. So you can use a Tailwind config.js file to override certain things like which colors you want and what font stack you're using, things like that. And in earlier versions, you'd say, well, I don't want to use font bold at all to try and keep the file size down. But that's not really a thing now, but just in time is out. What you can still do is still add your own classes in. So you can still, if you have a source file, you get base and then utilities and components. So you can add into any of those sections. So if you've got your own custom components or custom utilities, either add them into the source file yourself in the same way you would sort of do normally, or Tailwind itself has a set of sort of APIs, I guess, really, that you can hook into and either add additional plugins or write them yourself. Again, so you can reuse them across projects. But it's really easy to do that. And if you want to mix and match and use some sort of traditional CSS in places, then you can do that as well.
Okay. And why do people that use Tailwind think it's better than Bootstrap? Like, why make that change? Is there like one fundamental reason?
I think for me, personally, I guess I can usually look at a site and go, that looks like a Bootstrap site to me, like usually. But with Tailwind, that's not really a thing because the classes are so low level. So the things like display flex and colors and that type of thing, there's not really an obvious Tailwind looking site in the same way there is with the Bootstrap looking site. So maybe that, for me, that's part of it. And yeah, having done things like the Bartik rebuild and the Acquia, they're all built with the same framework, but you wouldn't know that, unless you start digging through the code and try and find it out.
So I guess a follow-up question for me is, because they're so level, do you find that you're not overriding stuff? Because I know that on more complex Bootstrap sites, a not insignificant amount of time is spent overriding base Bootstrap defaults in order to do something. Does that not happen with Tailwind? Are you able to kind of just use what you need and not what you don't?
Yeah, really, because there's not really anything to override, really, I guess, in that regard. So you could overriding yourself. You could put similar classes on, let's say things like display block and display flex, for example. You could, I guess, do that and then start overriding yourself. But there are tools around there to sort of stop you doing that now with some of the newer things. You could put it into your IDE and it'll put a red squiggly line underneath it if you've duplicated on class names, for example. So that's quite nice. But in some places, it's maybe sort of easier. So one of the things you can do in the config file is put important is to be true, and it will add the exclamation mark important to everything, which usually you wouldn't want to do, but for utilities, I think it's probably okay. But when I've then started looking at Tailwind on top of another framework like Bootstrap, then you can quite easily sort of start overriding stuff in arguably a better or easier way without having to start, doing really custom, maybe hacky things.
I mean, you're not suggesting using Bootstrap and Tailwind together, are you?
You could. I guess I probably wouldn't recommend it, but certainly for projects where I've taken on and there's maybe already a theme and it's built with custom CSS or with Bootstrap, and we want to start introducing Tailwind or utility classes, then yeah, you certainly could do that. And another option is you can add prefixes to all the Tailwind classes too. So I did this in the StarterKit theme for Drupal 7. Drupal 7 had a block class and Tailwind had a block class. So one was, the Drupal one was an actual block in the sidebar or a header, whereas the Tailwind one was display block. So they're both using the same class name. So you can just add a prefix. So all the Tailwind ones are TW-block, for example. Right. So it's really easy to add to an existing project as well. So you can mix and match.
So that's a great segue into my next question, which is obviously you've created a StarterKit module for Drupal. So you can use Tailwind CSS with Drupal. Is that accurate?
Yeah, definitely. It's really sort of unopinionated in terms of what you're using it with. It sort of came out of like a Laravel project typically, but yeah, you can use it with whatever you want, including Drupal. And I guess I was doing quite a few different themes when I started that project. I was like, okay, well, I'm always going to need a Tailwind config file. I'm always going to need a post-CSS configuration because Tailwind is written with post-CSS. I'm always going to want to have a source directory or a build directory or somewhere that the source files and the destination files need to live. So, okay, if I'm going to do this all the time, I might as well make a template or a starter kit, and then I can put that onto Drupal and everybody else and then can benefit from using it.
And did you say you started doing that with Drupal 7?
Yeah, I still maintain a couple of Drupal 7 sites for clients. Not starting anything new in Drupal 7, but we did a retheme of a site maybe 18 months ago, still on a Drupal 7, which was Tailwind based. So and for the most part, they're pretty much the same. Obviously, it's using TWIG in D8 and D9, but most of the Tailwind stuff is essentially the same, I think. D7 was using the TW prefix just to avoid that block name collision. That's been taken out in the D9 version. But yeah, for the most part, I think it pretty much works the same way.
What do you think makes Tailwind the best choice for theming Drupal?
I guess part of it is obviously down to preference, right? So I quite like it, and I've used it on various projects, and I like having that reusable API that I can just use the same class names across projects, but then also reuse those across non-Drupal projects. If I was working with Sculpin or something else that I tend to use quite a lot. An interesting sort of flip on that, I guess, is Drupal's a really good fit for Tailwind, partly because of TWIG, right? So one of the things we talked about earlier on is don't you end up with lots of classes in your HTML, which of course you do. But what Tailwind sort of encourages and recommends that you do is split some of those things out into partials. So rather than having to replicate, let's say you've got a button, this is the classic example, and let's say you've got 10 or 15 classes or 20 classes on this button. You don't want to copy and paste that all the time, right? So what they suggest you do is use a templating engine like TWIG and make a component out of that. And then you could just reuse that component in multiple places. So that cuts down on the duplication enormously. So you wouldn't see from something like DevTools, you just see all the classes, right? And in the end markup. But if I'm developing and I want to change the text size in all my buttons, I can do that in one place really easily without having to, copy paste loads of times, because it's one single source of truth for that button. So
I will say, from looking, so as we've been having a conversation, I've gone to the Tailwind website and looked at some code examples. And I will say, like, one of the benefits to me, like right off the bat, seems like very identifiable class names, right? So I find like in Drupal theming, a lot of times you'll look at the classes on something and you'll be like, I have no idea what this does or means, or like why this has like all of these nested classes, right? It seems like with Tailwind, it's a lot easier to understand that, like, oh, this thing is red. It has like, 5 pixels of margin, and oh, it's going to flex up and down depending on, what my screen size is, right?
Yep, exactly. Yeah, and that's an interesting point you mentioned. So as I said, it's not the first or the only framework that takes this approach. And sort of in between the time where I think Adam sort of first showed it on the YouTube streams and him actually sort of releasing it as a project, I was playing with a couple of the other ones. And I did a couple of projects with those, and they're very short of names. So rather than something like block, display block would be DB, or you'd have like F1 or something like, I can't remember exactly. Like they're really sort of short names. And I'd even then go back to those and I'm like, okay, so what does DB mean? So it's almost going too much the other way in that sort of situation. I think the Tailwind names are a bit more verbose, but readable enough. Like you can go back to it and go, it's okay, it's flex, and it's flex by default, and then it's MD block or SM hidden, so you can really sort of go in and see exactly what it's doing without going too much the other way and go, the class names aren't too short, but they're long enough for me.
So that brings up another question to me. Like, how do you go about learning that Tailwind language, I suppose? Like, what's the best way to learn what exists in the Tailwind framework and how you should kind of use it? Is there documentation? Are there training sites? How do you go about picking that up? Because I know, for most frameworks, that's a fairly, at least CSS frameworks, like, or like theming frameworks like Bootstrap or Foundation, there's a significant overhead to kind of learning that system. And it sounds like the way that TWIG is architected, there's a lot there, but it's got a different approach to learning that system.
Yeah, it's quite different. It's quite intuitive though. So I've seen streams and videos of people sort of using it and trying it for the first time. And once you sort of explain to them, give them some of the stuff, the basics, like they can usually sort of figure out what a class is meant to be like, even looking at the docs, which is quite cool. There's no shortage of any sort of training. Like there's obviously official docs on the Tailwind site, which are really good. There's lots of examples there that show you what they're doing. I'll go from there. But there's tons of people that open source code. There's videos and live streams of people using it on various projects at the moment. So there's no shortage of those. There are component libraries, as I mentioned. So there's an official one called Tailwind UI, which is a paid template component library, but there's also a couple of free community managed ones. So again, they're really good to sort of look at and go, oh, how are they doing this on this project, and sort of source code dive it and take a look and see what that's doing. And I guess there was a playground repo that was set up as well, so similar to the StarterKit, but now there's a site, it's called play.tailwindcss.com. So that's really great. So you can go into that. It's sort of like, what's the site that you go on and it shows you all the HTML and the CSS and everything. Blanking on the name. Copen. It's like Copen for Tailwind. So it's built by the Tailwind team, the Tailwind Labs team, but it knows about Tailwind, and you can change the config file in the browser. You can change, like add your own classes in and do it all in the browser. And that's really great for learning how things work. When we did a theme at one of my previous jobs, I sort of did a talk at the front end community of practice and sort of rebuilt one of the components that we'd built with custom CSS in Tailwind using that as a demo. So that was a really good one to show people. And I think, I'm fairly sure they've built also an IntelliSense library. So when you're used to using PHP Storm or something, and it comes and sort of gives you auto completion and suggestions, they've done that for Tailwind, which is also built into that tool, but you can also build it into your IDE. So you could start typing some like text red, and it would auto complete all the options for you, which is really great. And even show like color pickers based on your configuration, which is awesome.
Okay.
Sorry, we can't keep going on with the show because I'm now going to play with Tailwind CSS on that website.
Yeah, I gave a talk at a conference a couple of years ago and on Tailwind, and went through and did some examples and everything. And somebody asked me some questions, and I don't think it's very good, or whatever the reason, whatever it was. We had a good sort of discussion, and then Adam tweeted a question. I found out a few months later on, like, how did you find out about Tailwind or something like that? And the guy I was speaking to after the talk, essentially I'd said, these are some of the benefits. Go and try it and sort of let me know how you get on, see how you like it. And yeah, he sort of tweeted back, I watched this guy give a talk at a conference and I wasn't convinced, and I went and tried it, and now I really like it. I use it on my projects. So that was pretty cool.
So shifting gears back to Drupal for a second, and back to the StarterKit module that you've worked on. Can you talk a little bit about what that provides? Is it just kind of like your base Drupal Tailwind default setup, or does it provide more?
Essentially, it's meant to be quite unopinionated, because I was using it for myself, but also I was feeling that other people might want to use it. So as I said, Tailwind itself is built using PostCSS. So it needs a PostCSS configuration file. Tailwind itself can have its own configuration file, but it's not required. You're going to want some sort of input CSS file or PostCSS file that says, like, this is where, here are the placeholders, this is where all the base classes go, here's where all the components and utilities go. So you're going to want those, and then you're going to want to have an output directory. So once it's compiled, you're going to have somewhere to put them. So I was like, well, instead of doing that for every project, like, it's pretty much the same. So I might as well put it on there and open source it. So yeah, it's essentially my starting configuration for that, with a couple of templates to add some, like a container or whatever. But yeah, essentially just reduces startup time. And yeah, I was doing a bit of consulting work recently for somebody. I gave a talk at their user group, which I sort of assumed was on Tailwind afterwards, because he asked me to do some Tailwind work for them. It turned out the talk I gave was not on Tailwind, it was on something else, but they were using the StarterKit theme for all their projects, which is how they found me out. So that was pretty cool as well. Yeah.
So
Interesting.
The StarterKit's obviously a starting point to working with Tailwind and Drupal. Are there any themes that exist, like, that aren't the StarterKit, obviously, like complete themes that are using Tailwind with Drupal?
There's a few, I think. There's a few not based on the StarterKit, but I know a couple of other people have built Tailwind-based themes. Just trying to think of any sort of examples off the top of my head, but there is a Tailwind CSS Slack channel. So inside the Drupal Slack, we've got a Tailwind CSS channel. So we've got a little bit of a community within a community. And that's, not just Tailwind StarterKit related. That's any sort of Tailwind help. But yeah, it's supposed to be, I don't know if anybody's used or have used the Omega theme, and that was the same type of idea. Here's a version you can essentially clone, rename, and sort of change, and then now it's your theme now. That's sort of what I've been trying to do with this StarterKit.
If a website needs to support older browsers, are there any issues to using Tailwind CSS?
I think in one of the recent versions, maybe 2 or 3, they dropped IE11 support. But that, Drupal core itself has done that recently. Yeah, so that's probably the main thing, I guess. I think I've still got a couple of older ones, maybe because of that. But I guess because it's a PostCSS plugin, we could also use other PostCSS plugins. So if most people are probably familiar with auto prefixer, so that's a another PostCSS plugin that will add prefixes onto your classes. So once you've compiled all your CSS, it will go through and add things like mos dash or o dash or what the other ones say. It's not IE dash, but yeah, it'll add the vendor specific prefixes to your styling. So you could use something like that with it as well, which is fine.
So you've mentioned PostCSS a couple of times. I imagine that whatever theme is built on Tailwind needs some sort of build process. You can just integrate it with your CI workflow, and it'll just kind of work. Are there any tips you have there?
Yeah, so we use some sort of build process, as you said. So in the StarterKit theme, I've committed the CSS output just so people can try it on something like Simply Test Me and see a little bit what it did. Typically, I wouldn't do that, but we'd usually use something to build it anyway. So I've tried a few various ones over the last few years. Laravel Mix is one that's a Webpack wrapper. We use that quite a lot. Symfony has one called Encore, which is, again, it's another Webpack wrapper. But the newer versions of Tailwind, I think itself, there's a CLI version. So you could almost do an npm install global for Tailwind CSS and then just use Tailwind itself to generate Tailwind. So that's quite nice. So that's the way I've been doing it most recently, and just getting rid of sort of the fairly large sort of Webpack dependency and then just using Tailwind itself. And you can still pass in flags like, this is my input file, this is my output file, this is my Tailwind config, it's using PostCSS, and so you can pass all those things through on the command line or into a configuration file. And yeah, that's the way I've been doing it recently, and that's the way I've been sort of doing it in the StarterKit theme at the moment. But anything that compiles PostCSS will work.
So before we move on to the next question, when you're saying this, something just occurred to me. One of the really nice things about TWIG and Drupal 8, Drupal 9 is kind of the library system for components. Like you can basically say, hey, this CSS, this JavaScript goes with this TWIG file essentially. And if this TWIG file is being rendered on the page, make sure you include that CSS and that JavaScript as alongside of it. So you're kind of building up that list on the fly, depending on what Drupal sees as the need. It sounds like Tailwind is approaching that from the other end. Like you basically have a base CSS file that gets included everywhere, but it's smaller because it's more functionally based. Is that true? Like you really can't break stuff up based on what's actually being used, or is that what the just-in-time compiler figures out?
Yeah, that's typically what I've been doing, is just having one sort of global styles library essentially, and then just including that across the board. But yeah, as you say, it should be smaller because because of the just-in-time compiler, or in earlier versions of Tailwind, you use something like purge CSS that would strip all the unused styles out. The resulting files will be much smaller. So I guess there's a discussion then around, is there a benefit to doing the multiple libraries approach when the resulting style sheet is that much smaller anyway? And I guess just to clarify what I mean by just-in-time is, inside the Tailwind configuration file, there's a content key, and the content key is an array of paths and files. And what it's going to do is then scan through that. So it's going to be typically your TWIG directory or your templates directory, or any TWIG file, or I've got a file sometimes called safeless classes. It's just a text file, and it's going to scan through them and then say, yeah, you've used font bold, so it'll include it. But you haven't used MD : flex something, so we want to include that for you. So yeah, it's going to be a lot smaller than something normal, even with things like responsive components. So prefix classes like SM : is small breakpoint, MD is medium breakpoint. So all this is done through utility classes. But even with that, the resulting CSS is much smaller because you only get what you actually use. It can be a little bit tricky sometimes, because it's maybe used to concatenating classes together using TWIG. Maybe you have like text dash concatenate variable name. That won't work because it's fairly basic in what it does. It's just scanning through files looking for string matches essentially. So you might need to write your TWIG slightly differently. It needs to have the full string in there for it to find it. But yeah, that's what it's going to do. Just scan through files. Yes, we've used that class, generate it. So yeah, usually we're talking about a couple of kilobytes for a style sheet rather than some projects that I've seen which are fairly large and yeah, getting to the megabytes sometimes, usually, maybe. Yeah.
So as I'm perusing the Tailwind website, I'm seeing this component library, essentially, tailwindui.com, and the ability to basically purchase this component library and use it as much as you want, basically a for life plan. Do you know anything about those, and can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, so Tailwind itself, as in the open source framework / library, is all the very small utility classes. So yeah, all the text reds and the font weight bolds and everything. It only comes with one component. I think that's still true. I said that every time I give a talk, I'm fairly sure it's still one component, which is the container. So they do have a container. And in Tailwind terminology, a component is anything sort of with more than one property being applied to it. In the most part, it's not technically true anymore, really. But things like buttons, you'd make out of utilities, and nav bars you'd make out of utilities, so they're components. So yeah, everything in Tailwind itself, if you download it, are the really small classes. But yeah, it doesn't include things like nav bars or site or layouts or cards or any of those types of things. So what they've done, and I guess part of that is down to the reusability, right? Your buttons on project A are going to look different to project B, right? They're always going to look different. So you can't really reuse them in much the same way. But Tailwind UI is then building on top of the thing. So if you think about it, sort of Lego bricks, I guess. Tailwind CSS itself is the bottom brick that gives you what you need to do it. Then Tailwind UI is building on top of that. So it's making use of what's you're getting from Tailwind itself, Tailwind CSS itself, and then saying, if you add these classes together, you'll get a navbar. So it's a bit more sort of bootstrap level. Here's a navbar or a sidebar or a card or a testimonial section, but it's all built using Tailwind classes. And then once you've got it, yeah, you can copy paste what you want. And then typically you're going to change it to be based on your brand colors, or you're going to change some things around. So I guess that's the thing. But when you're using Tailwind CSS, like I say, you don't have a bootstrap looking site, but you do maybe a little bit now with Tailwind UI and these component libraries, because you can see where people have maybe started using that color purple they use on quite a few websites now. But I guess that just goes to show how good the defaults are. But yeah, Tailwind UI is one. That's the paid one, the first party one by Adam and the team. But yeah, there are some other sort of community-driven free ones as well. But they are really they're done by developers and designers on a team, so they are really good, and they put a lot of thought into the different color palettes and a lot of the spacing scales and things. And that was one of the things that really sort of appealed to me, was having, I've worked on projects, I'm sure most of us have, where you've got a margin top of 4 pixels, or you've got another one which is 11 pixels. And I'm looking, I go, well, why is it 11? Surely you should be between 10 or 12 or something. So things like the margin scale, it's sort of a design system class generator, I guess, in a way as well. So it's sort of going to encourage you to use sets of colors you've already defined, or that margin scale. And a lot of that is done by the team, but also with a designer's eye, not just a developer's eye. So that's really good as well. I put a lot of effort into things like that.
What do you think the future holds for Tailwind CSS?
It's an interesting question. So there's a whole team there behind it now. So for something that was just originally Adam initially with a few collaborators and co-creators, I guess. Adam was the main guy as far as I'm aware. But yeah, there's a whole team of people now working for Tailwind Labs, as in the company, based on sales and things like Tailwind UI and the refactoring. That's not the other book. What's the other one? Refactoring UI. I mean, we had another book maybe that we did. yes, there's a whole team now working on these things, and some of the things they've been able to sort of do in the last couple of months or a couple of years has been really quite impressive. Things like the IntelliSense thing, and some of the most recent one I think was class sorting. That's always one of the questions you get asked as well. Is like, you've got all these classes on your element. How, like, do you sort them in a particular order or something? And there's been, again, a couple of community sort of projects that are meant to sort of do that. But now they've come up with their own sort of suggested way, and they've just released a first-party product, which is essentially a prettier plugin, or is a prettier plugin, that will scan through your project and then reorder the class names for you. So that's one example. But
I've got one final question before we close out the show, and that is, you kind of hinted at this, but now I'm kind of curious. How does it handle responsiveness? Because you mentioned that breakpoints are like a class level thing now, whereas usually you're saying like this is the nav bar, and the nav bar has different styles depending on the breakpoint.
Yeah.
How do you handle responsive design with a system that's purely class based?
Okay. Yeah, I've hinted at it a couple of times, so I've not been maybe explicit enough about it. So, like we said, Tailwind has a lot of utility classes, things like flex and let's say flex and block, for example, for display flex and display block. Every class, I think, with a little asterisk, I'm fairly sure every class can also be done responsively. And I think that's true since the just-in-time compiler came in. I don't think it was true for the earlier versions because they were quite concerned with file size. But every class, he says, again, the caveat, you can add a prefix to, and it will add pseudo-states onto it. So inside the Tailwind config file, you can set a key called screens, and they're set to, I think, SM, M, and XL, GXL, I think. So they're all t-shirt size-based sizes. And you can prefix any class, and it will apply to that breakpoint. So they're mobile-first breakpoints by default. Again, if you want them to be different, or you want them to be larger, not mobile first, but not mobile first, then yeah, you change that in your config file. And when it regenerates the classes for you, it will generate them based on your config. But it's quite clever. It's essentially it's wrapping them all inside media queries. And then something I sort of wasn't aware of is that you can escape like the colon character inside class names. So you could actually use MD colon flex, and it will essentially just escape it. But yeah, if you've got a project, and I have had one that comes to mind, where for some reason you can't use the colon symbol and you want it to be double underscore, then again, change it in your config file. It'll regenerate the classes for you that way. But yeah, there's a whole load of them. We talked about responsive things, so small, medium, large, extra large. But if you want dark mode, you can put a dark prefix on a class, and it will only apply in dark mode using either the media query preference, or you can do it with a class on the parent as well. You can do things like active states, hover states, again, all by just adding a prefix to the beginning of the class name. And one of the nice things, again, not to make too many comparisons, but in some other frameworks, we end up with some like col MD4 or something, for an example, is the one that springs to mind. The media query is in the middle, right? So you need to change the class name in order to make it responsive. The nice thing that Tailwind has done is the class names remain the same, but you're just prefixing it with a pseudo element or a modifier. So if it's display flex, if it's flex, it's always flex, but it might be MD flex or SM block or MG hidden or something. So yeah, you can do completely responsive things all inside there. It's inside your HTML. And yeah, there's other plugins that add some other ones. There's one called interaction states, which I think probably still applies, that adds one called Hocus, which is hover and focus at the same time, which I quite like. But again, it's all done focus. Again, you can do this if you want to write. Once somebody did, what was it? It was like focus within or something that was still fairly new at the time, that needed a Webpack plugin or something, or a polyfill. Like, yeah, someone made a little plugin, Tailwind plugin for it. Essentially, it's a little JavaScript file and you include it in your Tailwind config, it will load it and then generate the prefixes or the classes for you. So yeah, it is super flexible in that way.
Well, Oliver, thank you for joining us, and thank you for helping give our listeners a little intro into Tailwind. It's certainly been a hot topic over the last couple of months.
No problem. Thanks very much. And yeah, if anyone, feel free to take a look at the StarterKit or Tailwind itself. Yeah, if you're not convinced, yeah, I'd definitely say, try it for a couple of days or a week, and usually the benefits usually sort of speak for themselves after that time. At least that was my experience.
Do you have questions or feedback? Reach out to Talking Drupal on Twitter with the handle Talking Drupal, or via email at show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts and other listeners on Drupal Slack in the Talking Drupal channel. If you're interested in show news, upcoming Drupal camps, local meetups, Chad's book corner, and Abby's biweekly game review, sign up for our newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
And you can promote your Drupal community event or talk on Talking Drupal. Learn more at talkingdrupal.com/camp promo.
Thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choosing the Become a Patron button.
And Oliver, if our listeners wanted to get in touch with you, what would be the best way to do that?
I'm pretty much OP Davis on the internet in general. So Drupal.org, Twitter, Drupal Slack, GitHub. Yeah, any of those things really.
And Martin, if our listeners want to get in touch with you?
Pretty much the same thing across Drupal.org and various social platforms. They can find me as Manclue.
And John, how about you?
I'm John Picozzi on all the major social networks and Drupal.org. Shout out, EPAM is looking for a solutions architect. So if you want to come work on a team with me, there will be a job posting for the USA and Canada in the show notes.
And listeners can find me pretty much everywhere at Nixman, NICXVAN.
And if you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking.
See you guys next week.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
All right.